I thank the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Executive Director of UNICEF, and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs for their briefings. The terrorist attacks by Hamas and other groups against Israel on the 7th of October have triggered an unprecedented crisis. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is tragic. Civilians are dying every day, including many children. The population is going hungry. The lack of water brings with it the risk of epidemics, and hospitals are overwhelmed. It is urgent that unfettered humanitarian access be guaranteed for the Gaza Strip that needs food, water, and electricity. The number of convoys must increase significantly in order to be commensurate with what is needed. A humanitarian truce is needed, which could ultimately lead to a ceasefire. France has significantly increased its humanitarian assistance through the chartering of a special flight last weekend and welcomes the commitment of the Secretary General, the work of UN agencies, and the work of humanitarian actors on the ground who are working in extremely difficult conditions. Our most sincere condolences go to the United Nations following the deaths of 63 UNRWA staff members. Civilians must be able to leave Gaza without being impeded from doing so, and we have constantly requested that for our own nationals and their families since the 7th of October. Nothing can justify the suffering of civilians who must be protected. All victims deserve our compassion, and all lives are valuable. Israel has the right to defend itself and the duty to do so in compliance with international humanitarian law, sparing the civilian population. France voted in favor of the resolution introduced by Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, which calls for a truce and humanitarian access and for the protection of civilians, which condemns terrorist acts and which calls for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. And I recall our condemnation in the most energetic terms of the terrorist attacks by Hamas, which in no way represents the Palestinians and which has nothing but contempt for their suffering. I also reiterate our call for the hostages to be released immediately and without condition. Following this vote in the General Assembly, this Council must be able to fully shoulder its responsibilities and achieve a just decision based on our common principles. France will continue to work on the new draft resolution presented by Brazil so that it can be adopted quickly. Mr. President, the extreme severity of the situation in Gaza should not lead us to forget what is happening in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. France firmly condemns the violence perpetrated by settlers against the Palestinian population, acts of violence which are increasing in the West Bank. We call on the Israeli authorities to put a stop to this. We must prevent this engulfing the entire region. France remains extremely worried following a launching of a shell that landed in UNIFIL headquarters in the south of Lebanon on the 28th of October. France is committed to avoiding a spread of this conflict. This war has reminded us, as if any reminder were necessary, that the world can no longer ignore the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and security. We all are aware of the conditions for this, namely the necessary security guarantees for Israel and a state for the Palestinians. We must all mobilize in order to restore a political horizon. The only viable solution is a two-state solution, and France will continue its engagement within this Council for it to adopt a resolution as quickly as possible. We owe this to the Israelis and the Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Ms. Dutton for the information provided. We pay tribute to you, your work, and your teams on the ground and mourn the loss of over 60 UN workers fallen in the line of duty. The past 3 weeks have been dramatic for Israelis and Palestinians and tormenting for the Middle East and many elsewhere. The overall death toll in civilian victims is frightening and unsustainable. We extend our condolences and deepest sympathy to the families of all victims, Israelis and Palestinians alike. Mr. President, 7th of October will remain a defining moment in the never-quiet history of the Middle East. Hamas, its brutality and terror, the worst in human behavior, will not and must not be forgotten. In the current utterly complex situation, there is an accumulation of competing urgencies: the response to terror and the continued rocket launches from Gaza, the liberation of hostages, the protection of civilians, the provision of humanitarian help, and the increased risk of spillover of the conflict. Let me quickly go through each of them. First, in its exercise of the right of self-defense, which we recognize and support like for every other country under attack, Israel is determined to eradicate Hamas. It should not be portrayed mistakenly as a license to punish Palestinians. It is beyond any doubt that conducting warfare in such a densely populated area as Gaza is difficult, challenging, very demanding, and it must be conducted prudently, professionally, and in compliance with international humanitarian law. We profoundly regret every innocent life lost without distinction. While circumstances may be different, a loss is always a loss. Therefore, there is need for maximum precaution not to harm those who are twice in danger: first from Hamas and their policies on one hand, and a fight they have not chosen on the other. It is therefore extremely important and urgent to do everything possible that civilian populations are not found in that hopeless place from where there is no escape. Second, nothing can ever justify abducting and holding hostages innocent people, children, women, and elderly, even less so using them, as Hamas is doing. They must be liberated, they must be brought home. We welcome efforts from various actors in this respect and urge them to continue. Third, unhindered humanitarian help at scale must be urgently provided to all those in need. We cannot contemplate children dying in the hospitals because of the lack of medicine or electricity or water or lack of communications. We cannot contemplate lack of food for entire families, adding to an already difficult situation the total breakdown of law and order because of lack of basic commodities. The government of Israel has promised that soon aid will flow in abundance. It should happen immediately. Those who are spared from the fighting do not need to die from hunger. Colleagues, we try to put ourselves in Israel's shoes, feel the trauma of terror striking with the ferocity we cannot forget, faced with an existential question with countries and proxies that seek openly to destroy it. I don't think anyone here or anywhere would feel at ease knowing that your next-door neighbor is just waiting for the right moment to kill you. How can this not bring back horrible memories, that fear and anxiety summarized in the Never Again pledge? But we also put ourselves in the very same way, in the shoes of the Palestinians, feeling the unexplainable pain of civilians caught in the midst of a war that has befallen on them, a war first imposed by Hamas and the likes, decided elsewhere by their masters who are rubbing their hands in the face of casualties they had anticipated and hoped for in a turmoil of all dangers. We feel for Palestinians who for decades, at every time they neared to the horizon of their future with their state, those against would always be quicker to disrupt it and push it further away. We feel for those thousands on both sides of this terrible divide who have lost their loved ones, the families of the hostages, and all those torn apart by death and grief and the insecurity of tomorrow. Wars are sometimes unavoidable because imposed, but they are always brutal. They bring inevitable destruction. They cause victims and, sadly, often casualties among those who don't deserve it. But even wars have laws, and they must be respected. We believe and trust that there is and must be a way to ensure the security of Israel and its people while ensuring the security of the perspective of all Palestinians who do not want war. Colleagues, beyond the tragedy unfolding in Israel and Gaza, the magnitude of the human suffering is impacting people across borders and identities, and we notice a sharp increase in the hate and division, including the threat of terrorism and targeted violence. This sharp and often confusing polarization fails to acknowledge our common humanity, and that the killing of innocent civilians, regardless of religion or ethnic background, is wrong, unacceptable. The frightening images of the bloodthirsty mob yesterday in Dagestan hunting for Jewish people is another appalling illustration of intolerable and appalling rise of anti-Semitism. No one should stay indifferent to rallies, to allow rallies where people chant "kill the Jews" or "destroy Israel." This is why there is so much need for wisdom, responsibility, and action on the ground and from this Council, because otherwise confusion, hatred, tension, and violence will continue, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but also elsewhere in the Middle East and beyond, dividing societies, fueled by strong emotions, ideologies, and beliefs, overpowering cold minds and reason, and overshadowing forward-looking perspectives. Last but not least, Mr. President, the serious risk of spillover. Hezbollah is playing with fire, and attacks from the northern border are becoming more and more threatening. If this continues, it may be a matter of time before the irreparable point is reached. It must be resisted, since it will only bring the region and all the countries involved near a catastrophe. In this respect, we are also very concerned for the situation in the West Bank. We condemn the extremist settler violence on Palestinians, which is totally unacceptable. Such acts must be fully investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. Mr. President, in the face of so much complexity and adversity, we think it is urgent to start thinking about the Gaza of tomorrow, the Gaza without Hamas, without extremists. There is a need to offer Palestinian civilians in Gaza a perspective, a new organization of life under a new administration. Hamas has let them down. Hamas has brought war to them. Hamas did not bring them prosperity because it invested in tunnels and rockets, in hatred and death. We need to start thinking how the fabric of the society can be repaired so that the children know that what shalom means, instead of being raised with and repeating death to the Jews. If not, the Hamas of today will only be replaced by the Hamas of tomorrow, maybe with another name, but with the same hatred, the same ideology, the same goals, embroiled in a never-ending cycle of hurting the other, acting falsely in the name of God they disrespect, and acting falsely in the name of a future they simply oppose. This is why there is a need to revive the political process as soon as possible, because in its absence there will only be unhappiness, poverty, discrimination, hatred, tension, never-ending violence, victims, and as it has happened many times, exploitation by terrorists, extremists, and their supporters. And let's not fool ourselves. The next war will be only deadlier. But it is preventable if we all work together with conviction and in good faith for peace, for lasting peace. And I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Albania and for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mozambique thanks the Brazilian President for timely convening this meeting. We also thank the briefers, Mr. Filipe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of United Nations Relief and the Workers' Agency for Palestine Refugees in East, Ms. Lisa Dothen, OSHA's Director of Humanitarian, Financial, and Resource Mobilization Division, and Mrs. Catherine Rossell, Executive Director of United Nations Children Fund, for their insight and update on the current situation in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, a glue and tragic situation is taking place in Gaza. We are horrified by reports of suffering and death of children, women, and men in Gaza. It is clear that the protection of civilians in time of war is not being observed. In this context, Mozambique joins our voice with that of many others in reiterating an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire to ease the suffering of millions of our brothers and sisters, Israelis and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, we should remind ourselves that the laws of war have established clear rules to protect human lives, human dignity, and respect humanitarian needs. These laws cannot augured or sidelined under any circumstances. They must be respected and observed by everyone, everywhere, at all times, without exception or excuse. We have condemned attacks on Hamas on 7 October against the Israeli children, women, and men. We strongly condemn the attacks against the civilian populations, in particular children, women, elderly, and the UN humanitarian staff. We call on their protection. That is vital. It is therefore imperative that we continue working together towards ensuring the safety and protection of civilians in the conflict zones. The world looks at us as experts, as a member of this Security Council, to respond expeditiously to the situation in the Gaza Strip. The United Nations awaits actions and leadership from this Council. Article 24 of the UN Charter clearly states that, I quote, in order to ensure prompt and effective action by United Nations, its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security, end of the quote. Accordingly, we reiterate our appeal to members of this Council to fulfill their functions and powers, to change the course of actions in the Gaza Strip. Mozambique, as a strong advocate for peace and dialogue in the Middle East region, particularly in Palestine, we echo the United Secretary General repeated calls towards resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the key to sustainable peace in the Middle East. For this desirable purpose, we firmly believe that the parties can work together through constructive dialogue for a lasting peace in full compliance with the principles of two-state solution based on Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and decisions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Mozambique, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished Mr. Minister, we fully support the convening by the delegations of the UAE and China of this emergency meeting of the Security Council on the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We were extremely concerned to hear the assessments of the situation on the ground from the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Filippo Lazzarini, UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell, and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton. Colleagues, the time has come to call things by their names. On the occupied Palestinian territory, the west bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip, a humanitarian catastrophe of biblical proportions is unfolding. According to incoming information, the number of people killed in the enclave has exceeded 8,000, half of which are children, women, and older persons. More than 2,000 people are buried under the rubble, half of which are also children. More than 21,000 people have been wounded. The number of internally displaced persons in Gaza has reached 1.6 million people. In UNRWA camps alone, there are 640,000 Palestinians. In the West Bank, more than 100 people have been killed and 3,000 have been injured. These chilling numbers are growing by the hour. We express our gratitude to all humanitarian workers on the ground that are working to exhaustion with a catastrophic lack of basic, including medical supplies, and also with an extremely high risk to their own lives. The scale of losses from UN agencies is shocking. 63 staff members have been killed, 22 have been injured, and 42 UNRWA objects have been destroyed. And we pay tribute to the UN staff that continue to work in unimaginable conditions and to those that have paid for this with their lives. According to media reports, during Israeli shelling on the Blue Line, 2 peacekeepers from the UN intermittent force in Lebanon have been wounded. The largest hospital in Gaza, Al-Quds, is under the threat of attack from the IDF. The Israeli Air Force is launching strikes 50 meters from facilities, demanding immediate evacuation. Almost 640,000 IDPs have found refuge in 150 UNRWA sites across the Gaza Strip. As a result of the bombing, 9 hospitals are entirely unusable, and the remaining ones are experiencing an acute lack of medicines. The blockade of the Gaza Strip has essentially become total. In the enclave, internet and mobile service has been switched off. It has been quite simply cut off from the rest of the world. Nobody knows accurately what is exactly happening there. This sort of blockade not only is sowing greater panic among the civilian population, it is directly undermining the work of medical and rescue services, which means it is leading to more civilian casualties. For this reason, it was not possible to agree on the 28th of October for the passage of another humanitarian convoy across the Rafah crossing point. We categorically condemn these actions, particularly in a situation in which, after shutting off communications, the most powerful airstrikes were launched on the enclave since the beginning of this escalation. In the conditions of active hostilities, the humanitarian response remains essentially nominal. Through the Rafah crossing point, the only point from Egypt, since the 21st of October, only 94 trucks have made it through, and according to incoming information, Israel is even stymieing these meager deliveries. As a result, in the Gaza Strip, there is an acute lack of everything: water, fuel, food, medicines, and people are frightened and have been driven to despair. On the 28th of October, upon the decision of the military political leadership of Israel, the armed forces of that country, ignoring the position clearly expressed by the international community in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted the previous day, began a ground operation in the Gaza Strip. After extremely intensive airstrikes, the Israeli army began to enter the territory of the enclave from several directions: in the south near Bureij refugee camp and Khan Yunis, and in the north near Beit Hanun. Colleagues, the Israeli authorities have different ways of describing their actions: expanding operations or preparing a bridgehead. But that's not the point. The point is that despite the unambiguous reaction around the world, West Jerusalem has begun the practical implementation of its plans to clear the enclave. In response, we have heard from the head of the Israeli Foreign Ministry saying that Israel rejects outright the UN's despicable call for a ceasefire. End quote. These comments did not go unnoticed as well, the comments from the permanent representative of Israel saying that UN has lost its legitimacy. There are shocking statements from a number of representatives in the Knesset that have been broadly circulated in the media saying that, and I quote, there is no symmetry in the Israeli response, and that, and I quote, the children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves, end quote. Unfortunately, this clearly shows that Israel is demonstratively ignoring the opinion of the overwhelming majority of UN, including many Western states, regarding the need for an end to the violence. This appalling situation has also been brought about because, due to the US position, the Security Council has essentially been paralyzed and has still not been able to adopt a resolution with an immediate demand for a ceasefire. We have twice made attempts to do so, but Washington and Western Jerusalem have entirely other plans: to wipe out the population of Gaza, or to force them out of the Gaza Strip, and to force the remaining Palestinian population to assimilate into Israel so as to resolve the Palestinian problem that way. In the context of the unprecedented scale of the escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we also have to note the current rise in tensions on the Syrian-Israeli border, which is linked to the active external interference coupled with the illegal military presence of the USA in the north and northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic. 6th of October, US forces, upon the instructions of President Joe Biden, launched strikes on 2 objects in the Abu Kamal area in the east of Syria. Washington said that the attack was undertaken in exercise of their so-called right to self-defense, American style. and this is thousands of kilometers from US territory. These illegitimate and in no way justified actions by Washington are nothing other than a gross violation of Syria's sovereignty and the norms of international law. In the present circumstances, such an illegitimate use of force could have extremely dangerous consequences because it could provoke an armed escalation encompassing the entire region. Colleagues, the time for half measures and half-hearted glib appeals is past. No humanitarian pauses will help. Humanitarian assistance cannot be provided in the height of hostilities on the ground. I hope that everyone here understands that. The number of victims among the humanitarian workers is running into the dozens. Ambulances have been bombed, and those that are left are unable to operate due to a lack of fuel. All noble humanitarian passages are, of course, important, but in and of themselves, they are not going to stop the war. The priority of the global community now is to stop the bloodshed, to minimize the harm to the civilian population, and to move the situation into the political diplomatic sphere. There must be a consolidation of collective efforts aimed at relaunching a fully fledged negotiating process between Israelis and Palestinians with the aim of realizing the UN-endorsed two-state solution. Upon the basis of that, an independent Palestinian state should be created in the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Mr. President, I would like to ask the permanent representative of the USA a question. Can you explain why you oppose a ceasefire? Does this mean that the USA, as a permanent member of the Security Council, supports the doctrine of a massive retaliation in Gaza? Where is your compassion for civilians that you so eloquently express at every Security Council meeting on Ukraine? And that's even though the lives of civilians in Ukraine are far from facing the same level of threat as Palestinians in Gaza. Or is it that you only think about those who are in the European continent and that Palestinian lives don't stir any emotions in Washington? And I would like to put the same question to the other Western delegations in the Council, who shamefully abstained on all of our draft resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Colleagues, your double standards are more than evident. The populations of your own countries are now calling for an answer to that, where there are mass demonstrations in support of Palestine. In this situation, the Russian Federation is making intensive efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground, aimed at rapidly resolving the crisis. We have sent a clear signal to all of the parties involved. There must immediately be an end to the fighting and the ensuring of humanitarian corridors for the emergency provision of assistance to all those who need it. And President Putin has been extremely clear. We categorically will not accept and condemn any terrorist acts. We express condolences to all those who have lost their loved ones in Israel and in Palestine and in other countries. But while condemning terrorism and the taking of hostages and demanding their unconditional release, we categorically cannot agree that the threat of terrorism can be responded to while violating the norms of international humanitarian law, including the indiscriminate use of force on objects of civilian infrastructure where civilians are known to be located, and alongside addressing the urgent tasks to end the current escalation of violence, we must immediately begin to agree on a strategy for collective actions for a political settlement to the conflict. In the past, this was done by the quartet of international mediators. However, the USA has done everything to undermine this effective instrument. On the agenda is establishing a collective mediating mechanism with an active role for states in the region. This is supported by the positive trends that before the previous escalation, the current escalation in Gaza, were evident in the Middle East. The Saudi-Iranian normalization, the reintegration of Syria into the League of Arab States, and the steady improvement in interstate relations between Syria and Turkey. All of this proves, all of this proves that the countries in the region are, when they take the situation in hand, and are not subjected to pressure from outside the region, they can achieve a great deal to stabilize the Middle East. Given the growing escalation in the Palestinian enclave and the unthinkably vast consequences for the civilian population, which is cut off from outside supplies, we believe it is important to hold regular open briefings such as the one today. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, without any discrimination, must remain within the focus of our constant attention as takes place in the context of other crises. Mr. President, Some colleagues, trying to shift the focus from the tragic events surrounding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, touched upon the 29th of October incident in Makhachkala airport in Dagestan in Russia. Exhaustive comments on this have already been provided by the Russian leadership and representatives of the regional authorities and the Muslim leadership. Assessing the actions will be provided by the Investigative Committee of Russia, which has launched criminal cases into this disorder. Dozens of people participating in this disorder have already been arrested and questioned. It's clear that any illegal actions are unacceptable. However, attempts to paint an unsanctioned action in the airport as an outbreak of anti-Semitic feeling in Russian society, particularly in the North Caucasus, is unacceptable. This region has long been an example of the peaceful and friendly coexistence of those from many different peoples. In Russian society, unlike Western societies, the principles of tolerance and religious and racial grounds are well rooted. In our society, there is the coexistence of the representatives of all of the main faiths: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. As is confirmed by data from the Russian security services, the events in Makhachkala are clearly seen clearly show signs of external interference, including information interference through social networks. And the traces of that, you will be not surprised at all, come from Ukraine. Some wish to abuse the situation and play on the feelings of Muslims in Russia by showing terrible pictures from the Gaza Strip, showing the horrors that are taking place there, the deaths of women, older persons, children, and medical workers. I would recommend that some of our colleagues do not try to shift the blame, but rather that they pay attention to the situation in their own capitals, where there are many Muslim demonstrations that are being brutally put down by the police. This is an example of Western countries' commitment to multiculturalism and freedom of expression. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for your stark and clear briefings. Let me start by recognizing the courage, commitment, and sacrifice of UN employees and humanitarian workers in Gaza, and in particular, the 103 aid workers, including the 64 UNRWA staff who have been killed in Gaza in the last 22 days. We also offer our sincere condolences to all Palestinians and Israelis who have suffered or lost loved ones. Since Hamas' terrorist attack against Israel on the 7th of October, the United Kingdom has underscored Israel's right to self-defense against terrorism. We continue to be clear that this must be done in accordance with international humanitarian law. Our efforts with our international partners have focused on the protection of civilians, securing and scaling up humanitarian access, and the release of hostages. Sadly, despite these efforts, the situation in Gaza deteriorates daily. Hamas bears sole responsibility for starting this conflict. President, I'd like to highlight 3 priorities. First, we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law, including the principles of proportionality, distinction, and necessity. This requires all parties to take every possible step to avoid the harming of civilians and the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. Second, we must urgently cooperate to scale up aid into Gaza and to ensure sufficient access points are open. For this to happen successfully, there needs to be a safer environment, which necessitates humanitarian pauses. We support UN-led efforts in this regard. Since the latest escalation in Gaza, the UK has committed over $36 million in additional aid to the occupied Palestinian territories. An RAF flight arrived in Egypt on the 25th of October, carrying 21 tons of UK aid for Gaza. But the access environment needs to improve immediately so that these and other life-saving resources can reach the people who desperately need them. Third, we cannot allow this conflict to spread. We call on all countries in the region to help avoid escalation and warn non-state actors not to exploit the current situation. President, the Palestinian Authority has a key role as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Other states to support the PA. We call on the Israeli authorities to tackle the rising number of settler attacks and killings in the occupied West Bank, recalling that it is their responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians there. The UK retains the long-term goal of a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine coexisting peacefully. To reach that goal, we have a responsibility to ensure a plan for Gaza that offers the population hope, security, stability, prosperity, and effective governance so that their political wishes can be fulfilled. In this regard, some fundamental principles apply. There should be no mass displacement of Gazans to neighbouring countries. The Palestinian Authority should play a central role, and nothing should be done that cuts across progress towards a two-state solution, with Gaza as an integral part of a Palestinian state. Thank you, President.
I thank the permanent representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Japan.
I thank Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini and UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton for your briefings. I join other colleagues in expressing our respect to all humanitarian actors who are tirelessly working under unimaginable conditions. Mr. President, since October 7th, thousands of people have been killed and wounded. The tragic sequence of events shows no signs of abating, descending further into a devastating cycle with unimaginable losses of life and the destruction of civilian facilities. Just recently, Israel announced the expansion of its ground operations in Gaza. Japan has been paying careful attention to the situation with grave concern. Japan has expressed unequivocal condemnation to the terror attacks committed by Hamas and other militants and extends its sincere condolences to all victims. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. The international community should never tolerate such a heinous act. Hamas does not speak for the Palestinian people. Every member state has the right to defend itself and its people in accordance with international law. At the same time, all parties must act based on international law. The deterioration of the situation in Gaza has led to a deepened humanitarian crisis to an unprecedented level of severity. The loss of any more innocent lives, regardless of their nationalities, religions, or ethnicities, is simply unacceptable. No one's life is more important or less important than that of others. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, consistent with international humanitarian law, must be allowed in order to alleviate the devastating humanitarian situation. While several trucks have crossed through the Rafah crossing, hundreds more must follow suit to meet the dire need of over 2 million people. And in this context, we should also take further steps immediately, including humanitarian pauses and establishment of humanitarian corridors. Additionally, we express our profound concern regarding the disconnection of telecommunications networks, which disrupts vital communication channels between those in Gaza and the rest of the world, and also impedes the work of media and humanitarian communities. It is especially imperative to ensure these networks function to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance and the safety of humanitarian workers. As the situation is rapidly evolving, it is critical for all parties in the region to avoid exacerbating this conflict. The international community has a duty to redouble its diplomatic efforts in order to prevent the instability from spilling over into the region and to calm the situation with a sense of urgency. The Security Council needs to act urgently to find a common ground among all Council members to deliver a meaningful message and help to all parties, to all in distress. While we remain unable to act, lives are being lost day by day, minute by minute. We must also recall that ultimately there is no alternative to a two-state solution. All parties must make serious efforts to this end. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for giving me the floor. And let me begin by thanking Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for their briefings on the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza following the resurgence of conflict in the Middle East after the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel on 7th of October. 23 days after the attacks in southern Israel, with the attendant loss of lives and abductions, we are appalled by the many lives that are being lost in the ensuing conflict, as well as its humanitarian consequences. We are equally concerned by the potential spread of the conflict to the wider region and the heavy toll that it bodes for innocent civilian populations. Last Friday, within the context of the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, majority of the members of this organization, through the residual rule of the Assembly, called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce, demanded of all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, and asserted the need for continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential supplies and services into the Gaza Strip. It also called for the immediate and unconditional release of all civilians held captive and demanded their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in compliance with international law. Taking into account what the Assembly has said, we must as a Council build upon the convergence of views on this crisis to support the Secretary General, UN agencies and staff, including UNRWA, to deliver critical care and support services to the nearly 672,000 internally displaced persons sheltering in the 149 UNRWA, as well as the many other innocent civilians who are living under desperate conditions. From recent reports of UNRWA, the number of trucks that are allowed into Gaza will need to be scaled up significantly if we are to make any impact in addressing the desperate humanitarian needs of the 2 million people in Gaza, especially in the health and food security components and the supporting supply needs. In this context, we appeal to Israel, Egypt, and other stakeholders to work constructively towards enhanced humanitarian access through the Rafah border crossing, and to all donors to step up financial and material contributions to UNRWA to meet the growing and urgent humanitarian needs of the people of Gaza. We must also use the weight of the Assembly's decision to strenuously encourage the efforts of leaders in the region, especially Qatar, as well as the ICRC, that have been at the forefront of negotiations to secure the release of all Israeli and foreign hostages, to impress upon the Hamas militia to heed the demand of the international community for the immediate and unconditional release of all captured civilians. Holding innocent civilian populations as captives is wrong and unacceptable, regardless of the motives. Mr. President, the past 23 days has also been one of blood, pain, and anguish, as we have not seen in the region in recent times. Not to make further efforts to stop the fighting would be truly tragic. We encourage regional and international leaders to act as moderating influence on the parties to help de-escalate the conflict and prevent its further spread in the region. The impact of the conflict on women, children, and the elderly has been enormous, and we owe it to them on both sides to bring this crisis to an end. In concluding, we reiterate our condolences for all lives lost and remind the Palestinian and the Israeli people of their interwoven history and shared geography, both ancient and modern.
The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. My apologies for taking the floor, but I need to respond to some comments made by the Russian permanent representative. Since the beginning of this conflict, the Russian Federation has spared no moment trying to either directly or indirectly blame the United States for this crisis. It is irresponsible. It is false that we are responsible in some way for what is going on. No state has worked harder than the United States to try to resolve this situation, and we continue to work hard to do so. This is a typical Russian narrative that has, again, no basis in fact. Russia, frankly, has no credibility. Its prevarication knows no bounds. It claims to care about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I think it's pretty clear. Russia doesn't care about solving crises, humanitarian crises. It creates them. If you have any doubts, just look what's going on in Ukraine. Regarding U.S. actions in Syria, we responded to attacks against U.S. personnel acting in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. I think Russia will recall the UN Charter. It has been working to drive a stake through the heart of this sacred document through everything that's been doing in Ukraine. So let me just close by saying, Mr. President, the United States will continue its efforts to do what it can to ease the situation in the region. And my hope is that Russia will step up and be a responsible player in the Security Council and work with the international community to try to bring about an end to this very, very sad situation. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. The permanent representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be brief. And taking stock of the latest comment from my American colleague as an admittance, we didn't hear a response to the question that we put to him, but I would like to put a rhetorical question to him, which I don't require an answer to because it's a rhetorical question and the answer is obvious anyway. How many times during the present crisis has the United States initiated a meeting on the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Thank you.
Of the commitment of Brazil at the level of the foreign minister, and I am sure